Hello, everyone, and welcome to our shop talk today. I'm so excited that you are here, and and want to let you know this is going to be it's intended to be an interactive conversation. So feel free to join us to offer your thoughts and comments and ask questions, but also to share your experiences and to offer insight into the topic. For this series is intended to bring together current, emerging, and aspiring arts professionals to talk about their areas of expertise in the performing arts field. And of course, today we're going to be talking about commissioning local artists and what it means to provide those kinds of art opportunities for artists that are in your area. I am Christopher Massenburg, also known as Dasan Ahanu in the arts community. And I'm the Rothwell Mellon Program Director for Creative Futures at Carolina Performing Arts and one of the co-producers for the Digital Commons. And Carolina Performing Arts is the sponsor of the Commons Festival. So excited. I am joined here by someone that I'm happy to be able to have this conversation with. So I'm going to allow Brian to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Howe, known in the arts community as Brian Howe. I'm an arts journalist in Durham. Until pretty recently, I was the arts and culture editor at INDY Week for about 8 years, which is how I got involved in the Commons in the first place, and that established that collaboration. And I'm really happy to be carrying that on now that I'm a freelancer for the INDY instead of an editor.
Thank you. And I'm glad to have you here, Brian. And just to let everyone know, this conversation will be recorded and distributed at a later date. So by participating, you're granting consent to be recorded. So I want to make sure you know that before we move on. And also that, you can also let others know that they'll be able to find this recording later and they can find out about the wonderful conversation that they missed. One of the things we want to let you know is that we're going to be using the raise hand function. If you have a comment, a question, or if you have an insight into one of the things that we're talking about. And we have a wonderful Zoom host who is helping, Miss Angela, who will help us navigate and make sure that we can recognize everyone whose hand is raised. All right. If you want, you can say your question. You can unmute yourself and say your question, but if not, you can also, when you're recognized, that your raised hand is recognized, you can put your question in the chat and we'll get to it as well. All right, everybody feel good?
Yeah.
Cool. I will say I am a Southern boy, and in that fashion, I ask a lot of questions and ask for a lot of affirmation before moving forward. It is a product of being raised Southern and in the church. There's a lot of call and response involved. But you also can, you have the opportunity to be able to unmute yourself if you would like, so that we can keep the conversation free flowing, or you can mute yourself as well. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this conversation. And what I want to do first is kind of, Brian alluded to it, but I want to start by talking a little bit about how we got here. And, Brian was able to be a part of the first Commons Festival. And I'd like for you, Brian, if you could talk a little bit about, your work with Abby around that and some of the thinking, both around the Commons, but also around the idea of the embedded writer and that process.
Right. The embedded writer aspect was my main official participation in the project. So the Commons began, this was only the second season of the Commons. And Dasan, I just want to say congratulations for wrapping up this great month-long series and spearheading this whole effort and keeping the Commons alive when there was really no indication necessarily that it was going to be something that happened again. So congrats and thank you for that.
Thank you.
It began last year, or I guess the year before at this point, with Alexandra Ripp. Alexandra Ripp was the Distill Fellow at Carolina Performing Arts, which is the role that Laura DiGiulio here holds now. Alex was a good friend of mine, and so the idea of doing a local performing arts festival was entirely her brainchild. That was something that she was passionate about, is engaging the local performing arts. And in addition to being a dramaturg, she has some background as a performing arts critic, a theater critic in particular. So she was interested in the writing aspect of things as well. So as far as the festival itself goes, the point was much like it was this year, which was to connect with local artist communities, give them resources, and build relationships with them. And that whole aspect of it was really, like I said, Alex's brainchild. I helped her kind of develop it over, many nights at Carburitos, eating burritos. But that was really her. So when the aspect of the idea of embedding writers came into it, like I said, Alex had a background in theater criticism. Obviously, I write arts journalism and criticism for a living. And at the time, I was still at the INDY, so I had the wherewithal to say that, yes, we could publish writing produced in concert with this project in a special section on our site. I specify a special section because it was deliberately set off from our kind of everyday week in, week out traditional style of arts criticism. This part of the project kind of developed pretty organically. At the outset, we had this grand scheme where we were going to embed all these experienced writers, but we were also going to have a pipeline of kind of young, aspiring, inexperienced writers who were going to be working with and under these experienced writers to document these performances. So there was going to be a lot more robust activity happening on the writing side. And in theory, it was going to be a pipeline for me to find new talent to then use on a weekly basis as Indie Week freelancers to cover the arts around here. Of course, as these things do, when they meet reality and there's not many people running them, that idea got considerably streamlined by the time we got down into the nitty gritty of it. There was just no bandwidth to bring on and manage that many writers. But we did bring on several professional writers, and they were able to really embed with the performances in a way that wasn't possible this year because of COVID. This year, by necessity, those interactions were a bit more limited, I believe. Although I know, Kaisha Jennings, one of the writers, for instance, felt that she had a lot of space to have conversations and exert influence around Ishad and Ayana's performances. But last year, the writers were really able to spend time in the studio with the artist a lot. Alex and I were often in and out of the studios, just checking in during development. It was really cool. Another aspect that was unique last year, besides the university itself commissioning writers rather than just courting and hoping for outside critical coverage, was the fact that to a large extent, we let the performers decide, if not exactly who, then what kind of person they wanted to engage with their work. So our premise here was that traditional criticism was becoming obsolete, and it was changing. Old lines of authority were dissolving at the time. The convention for a very long time for, say, a newspaper would be to have one theater critic, more often than not a white man, whom everything that anybody put on stage would pass through for decades. And there would just be this one person maintaining kind of their field of authority over everything that passed through. Social norms, cultural norms have been changing to a point where that's no longer appropriate. And I think we're all really well aware of the limits of that approach and the blind spots of that approach. So what Alex and I came up with wasn't like a template, like this is what arts criticism is going to be, but it was more like a clearing away of what it was so we could start to find out. So what we did was, we had somebody who was doing a show that heavily involved issues with immigration from Mexico. So rather than an arts critic, we had a reporter on immigration embed with that person and write about their piece. Another piece had a strong queer BIPOC core, and they wanted somebody along those same lines to engage with the piece who would be primed to understand it in the way that they intended it. This is not how things are normally done in criticism, where artists choose who is going to write about them. It's something I think we as editors, or editors of conscience anyway, have put a lot more thought into recent years, who we assign to write about what thing. But that idea of artists choosing their writers is definitely untraditional, and produced some really warm and close and trusting collaborative relationships that modes of writing were able to come out of that couldn't have come out of a traditional critical relationship. The writing it produced was really interesting. And like I said, that writing wasn't a goal. It wasn't like, this is what arts criticism should be now. But it was like, here's one way to try and do it differently and see what happens as we try other ways to do it differently until we see what really works and what is equitable.
Wonderful. And one of the things, just so for everybody knows, that coming from that, with the Commons, there were these embedded writers. The artists that were selected were in residence, so they had access to resources and time in our venues in order to develop their pieces and get them ready for performance. And then when the performances were put up, there were talkbacks with the artists, as well as some additional workshops that were a part of the Commons Festival. And that's the framework that we looked to this year for. And also just the support of the whole organization. One of the things that's beautiful about this is that, Angela, who is, helping us with this Zoom, is one of the production managers and the lead production manager working with the Commons. And then, of course, there's Ellie Pate, who is here, who's an artistic coordinator for CPA, who's one of the leads in working with the artists as they move through this process. But I wanted to have that foundation because there's a couple of things that I think are important about the Commons was both the support that it provided for artists, for area and North Carolina-based artists, the planning of opening up and pushing the boundaries of criticism, and then the putting the possibility of how that criticism happens and who does the criticism in the hands of the artists, and including their voice as a way of empowering the artist. So it's not just providing an opportunity, but it's really providing the artist with an opportunity to be able to have a say in the way things are done. And so when I heard about the Commons and was looking at that during this pandemic, of course, there was a larger conversation about how to support artists, especially artists in our community. So much had gotten canceled, and there was a struggle, especially when your industry is disrupted so rapidly and at such a scale. It's one thing for things to slowly ramp down; it's another for everything to stop. And so what we looked at was, okay, what can we do? And for the digital Commons, what we were able to do is to think about how to provide an opportunity to commission some work from artists. We were able to commission an additional artist than before. The Commons had 3 artists. This time we sought to commission 4 artists. We knew there were going to be challenges with the writing because due to the pandemic, we weren't going to be able to embed a writer in the process. We had to think about COVID protocols and how to do that, but we were able to pull a panel together and do an open call. And from the beginning, we wanted to kind of revisit what it meant to kind of open this opportunity for area artists. And part of that is figuring out how to make sure we spread the word in a way that would encourage artists who are familiar for looking for these opportunities, but artists who aren't used to looking for and applying for these kinds of opportunities, to encourage them to put their name in the hat. We had a wonderful panel from the community that we used, which is a model very similar to what the original Commons had. They had a judging panel. We replicated that process, built the call, got the artists in. The difference this time, which I think provided us an additional opportunity, is that we couldn't do a live performance. And so what we decided to do was to stage the performances and have them taped. so that we could then stream the pre-recorded performances, which offered us the opportunity to add the filmmakers and videographers to the process. So in addition to being able to commission for artists and to commission writers, we now had the opportunity to commission filmmakers and videographers, which gave us a broader reach across the local arts community to be able to commission work from more artists than normal. And we commissioned 2 videographers, paired each one of them with 2 artists. And the artists got a chance to work with the writer, have that interaction, but also to work hand in hand with the videographer about how to present the piece, and then had the resources of our staff and our venues in order to stage these performances. And so that is how the Digital Commons came to be. Mm-hmm. But in that, what that shows is that it's an intent to support this artist community, a very necessary conversation about how to cast as wide a net as possible, and to make sure that this was an opportunity that folks knew about, to commission as wide a number of artists as possible and be able to help them during this time, and to maintain that input and that room for the artists to talk about what they want to accomplish and how they want to accomplish it, and to continue to, we didn't have the luxury of being able to build that embedded experience, but to be able to create an opportunity for the writers to write some pieces that helped, showcase these artists and their work, but to give them some room to write some pieces in ways that fit their voice.
Yeah. What I encountered, as you know, I wrote a column about this for my Orange County Arts Commission column. And what I found talking to the artists, for the majority of them, not only was this their first time doing work like in this context, having academic funding, academic space, these kinds of resources to produce a work like this. This was their first time doing that. It was their first time for doing a number of things, and in several cases. I remember Johnny Lee Chapman said to me, Howard Kraft, whom he really respects as an elder, that was my first ever artist interview. And you now talking to me, Brian, this is my second artist interview. And you can take what I'm telling you and you can translate that to people in such a way that they'll say, maybe they'll see oh, art isn't this kind of strange alien thing that happens somewhere else, but it's something that can connect to my life and be a part of my life, and the process can unfold from there. So in addition to the benefit to the writers themselves and the readership of the INDY and embedding the writers, I think maybe there was a real benefit for the artists there who maybe haven't gotten to have those kinds of critical conversations and that kind of serious attention in that certain context paid to their work before.
Yes, for these artists, one of the beautiful things about this festival is all these artists are emerging artists in the true definition, in terms of artists who are building their career. They're all younger artists in terms of being, 32 and younger, between 25 and 32. And this was a very new experience to have this kind of work commission, to be able to stage this kind of work, to be a part of a process like this was new for them. And what they will gain from this is both being a part of the festival. Of course, what this means on their resume is major. They're going to get this professional taping that they can then use, add it to their portfolio. But these pieces are all pieces that are replicable in terms of the performances. These are things that they can stage again, tour. That opportunity is major for each one of them, and all of them have aspirations of continuing to grow. Ayana talked about wanting to continue to do more things in the theater and in performing arts. Lee has aspirations. He's already, been involved in being able to be a part of some really dynamic installation work in performance art. AJ as well. So all of these artists are hoping, see this as an opportunity to envision more possibility for their work. And I think that it was really an amazing thing to have happen. And of course, to be partnered with an organization like Carolina Performing Arts, which is a well-known, university presenter. is always valuable. As an artist, these things are very, very important. And for folks around you in your periphery and in your network to see you being involved in them, because I, have gotten to see the response as each one of them has announced that they were a part of this. And there's a dance there that happens. It's like part of it is about the reputation of the reputation of the organization and the work that it has done. Part of it is about our perception of institutions, but both of them, when you're a part of something like this, can benefit the artist, regardless of what the perception is. To see these artists be a part of this carries weight and can draw additional opportunities to each one of them. So, and then one of the other things I think is also important, and I'm interested to see if this is the same for writers. One of the other things that a lot of artists consistently talk about, regardless of where you are in the world, and I've seen this conversation happen so often, is that many feel that they have to build a reputation that includes being involved in things that are larger than their local area in order to be able to gain opportunities at home.
Isn't that interesting?
And so the other importance, the other part of this conversation is to have something like this happen with Carolina Performing Arts, kind of pushes back at that notion. It is a major cosign at home. When so many artists feel that before they're able to be commissioned by major institutions here, that they have to do something of note that is away from home and have that reach back home. And so that's the weight of having institutions like CPA here to do things that are intentional, that provide opportunities for area artists, because very many of them know these institutions are here, come to support the programs, come to master classes and do these things, but they do not expect to ever be commissioned by these organizations until they can make a way. And so this is a major change in that belief. It doesn't topple it. There's still that perception, but it is a major step in pushing back at that notion.
Right. It's a counterexample. Like you said, you reached out to, Dasan, tell me if this is getting ahead of where we want to be, because I think this topic easily take up the whole hour. Right. But what I was most struck about by the Commons this year, out of all the innovative things about it, the thing that struck me as most notable. Okay, you look at the call for submissions that the Commons sent out. It looks virtually identical to all other open calls for submissions that art presenters sent out, including the ones that the Commons sent out last year, when we got a reasonably diverse, but still, more homogenous than we probably would have liked lineup of candidates. This year, same call for submissions that you see everywhere, produced a roster of all people of color working largely in spoken word and storytelling with some dance. So if you're an informed observer of these things, the immediate thing you ask yourself is like, what was different about this call for submissions and the results that it produced, and this other identical call for submissions that produced the homogeneous results we usually see? And it really seems to have been as simple a matter as you taking this call for submissions into your contact networks and telling individuals who you're already in community with, no, we want you to apply specifically. Like, everybody's welcome to apply. We want you to apply, and you are invited. Because as we all know, open calls for submissions aren't truly open if you just kind of put them out there and you're like, sure, apply if you want, because they come loaded with a lot of codes and assumptions about who is invited into that world and who usually participates in that world. So the most remarkable thing to me about the Commons was how it broke through that kind of constant logjam that so many presenters seem to find intractable somehow, with such a simple solution as putting a person of color in charge and giving them free rein to promote it through their networks. Could you speak on that process some more?
Yes. So yes. And one of the things, that particularly battle with, a lot with large and small arts institutions is that idea. It's that the desire for a more diverse outcome ends up stopping at putting out the call and saying everyone's welcome. And there's no recognition of that code, that there is a perception that is had of these organizations. It's almost as if people underestimate how much attention artists are paying and are aware of the institutions in their community. And so my thing is, I'm like, no, we have conversations about y'all. Like, I've said it to the Arts Council, we have conversations, and that word travels very quickly. And anytime we gather, we talk about where we've had success, where we've ran into walls, and a lot of times at a certain point, especially artists who are a little older, will say, I've stopped having hope that opportunities that will be provided or that we're really welcome with some of these institutions. That has an impact on younger artists, because these are the folks we're looking up to. And so when they say, I've been trying for years and nothing's come of it, we're like, okay, I guess we're going to work around it or outside of it. And so for me, I knew that when we put out the call, that I had to follow the call and go out and tell people, no, like, for real, we really want you. And I got a lot of phone calls. Many of them, a good portion of folks applied, but there were a lot of folks who still, even after we talked, they talked through their idea with me. And I was like, no, like, for real, like, really, really apply. They didn't. And it's, and I think that seeing the artists who were selected is going to have an impact on them in the future, because they'll look back to the conversation we had when I was like, no, for real. And then they'll see who was selected and be like, oh my goodness, no, for real. Like, this was really the intent of this. And I know, and that carries a weight too, because it has to all work how I'm saying, because otherwise my word is impacted. If I say that and folks apply, and then what happens on the back end of that looks differently than what I'm telling them what our intent is, then I have to wear that and carry that. So one of the other things about that was that I felt very confident with the folks who I was working with, that I could say that with confidence. And and also the other thing about it is that knowing that there's a panel process, we really picked a really solid group of panelists from across the community in terms of our panel. And that was also I also had to have certain conversations as well with some of the panelists who came into this thinking that they were going to be asked to be a part of a panel and asked to kind of uphold the status quo. And it's like, no, we really want y'all to think about, the quality of art and what's your vision for what the festival should like and what can be accomplished. And they were able to have a conversation and come to a place. And Ellie and Lauren, feel free to talk about what that meeting was like, to be able to come to a place and amongst themselves realize the possibility they had with the applicants. And so all of that kind of fell in line, but it started just like it started with going into it more really, really intentional. And I knew I needed to help facilitate that. And so, yeah, that was but for me, the takeaway from that is that if you're going to mention community and you're going to mention local community and local arts community, whatever you're intending to do with them, the first step is identifying partners and collaborators that can be involved at the beginning. I'm here, so I had a chance to be able to do that. If I wasn't in this position, I would hope that the first step would be to then reach out and bring some folks to the table from the arts community to talk about and to look through what this looks like. Mm-hmm. And then based on that input, if you open the door and you have the conversation, what you have is ambassadors. And so in addition to the call, and in addition to reaching out to other organizations and saying, spread the word, it is those ambassadors who will be able to be on the ground and say, no, we've had a conversation with them. We know what you normally expect or what you think, but we can vouch for this process. And that goes a long way to increasing who actually decides to participate. And so that's just something that I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that it's an important piece that gets missed. Mm-hmm. It's like the organization or the institution is aware that maybe, previous reaches didn't get as far. And so their intent is to promote further or to increase the amount of time that they put the call out. It's like do more of the same. And it's like that doesn't change the perception.
Yeah.
And so you have to kind of figure out what is the perception. And in order to do that, you have to ask the community, like, how do y'all normally see these things? And then from there, you can figure out what you need to do.
Right. And in a way, I mean, this is exactly how it always works. These open calls for submissions are always emanating from and moving through certain networks and communities. They just much more often get kind of stuck and reverberate through the usual white networks and communities. And so it's like I wrote in the piece, like where you start, like 100% determines where you're going to end up with a project like this. And you mentioned the impact it had on the artists who were the beneficiaries of it. But I think of the even broader impact it has for other artists who see them and say like, oh, they're not kidding. This could really be for me too, without you, Dasan, having to call them directly and invite them one by one. And also to other institutions and organizations who seem to always like scratch their head about their lack of diversity when they are inviting everyone. So why aren't any people of color applying? Well, I think this is a really instructive example of that. I mean, if even like a person of color who's trained in modern dance, whose work totally fits within this world, doesn't necessarily feel like they're invited and that this world is for them, then why is a hip hop artist like Ishad or a spoken word artist like Ayana, why is it ever even going to cross their minds that these kinds of resources and support and this kind of forum is something that's available to them where they would fit in? But now through this example, some people can see that it actually is.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that Alyssa has a chance to ask her question, because she has a question. I was getting
ready to, yes. Oh. Yeah, Angela put it, let me know. So yes, thank you. I'm glad, thank you, Lauren. We were saying it at the same time. Alyssa.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect back that I feel like a constant theme in some of what y'all have been discussing is both accessibility, like perceived accessibility for people who are applying to something. And I feel like that just that notion of like inviting someone in is such a powerful thing to reach out and like just co-sign or say like, I see the work that you're doing, and that feels like a really important piece of it. But the other thing that I wanted to bring up is just this notion of local organizations and the way that they do engage with community and invite community participation, and just this notion of Dasan, you were sort of talking about this of accountability from the institution to the community. And I was just wondering if you could speak more about like if that word specifically, or just like if that was something that came into play both in choosing artists, but also in thinking about how the Commons Festival was, how you collaborated with artists during the Commons Festival, and then like moving forward from it, like how that community accountability exists or will exist in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. That's a really good question. Yes, I think that collaboration, that community collaboration and that community accountability is really important. So, one part is being able to get people to apply and be a part of the process. Recognizing that if you're successful in getting a breadth of folks who haven't engaged with this process before to be a part of it, you have to be very careful about what the process is for them, because they can get the opportunity, not have a good experience, and then you're not helping your reputation within that community. It actually affirms the perception of why they're not welcome and shouldn't be involved. So then it becomes, okay, so what kind of support and resources do you provide? What is their experience like? And and we had a really good team. And I'm really, thankful for Ellie and Angela in the way, because each of the artists raved up just about the experience, and because once again, this is new for them. And so going through this full lights and production, staging, all of these things, they decided for themselves and kind of worked through how they wanted each piece to look. So there wasn't a set designer, there wasn't, there weren't these pieces that might be in place. There wasn't a director, so it was also providing them with room to kind of work through this. And kind of learn from being able, and for me, I think that's a different kind of experience that if they had all of these pieces available that were there to then start to kind of jump in with their idea and start guiding and directing it. I don't think it's worth it, but it's just a different experience than to affirm them and give them this room. Which I think empowers them going forward, because they're going to be in a lot better place to move to the next opportunity where there may be more hands and be able to assert, no, I want it to look like this. I want this kind of lighting. Which they were able to kind of, like being in the rehearsals and watching them engage and like, I like this. No, I want this, in a way, to see that happen over the course of, they only had about 4 or 5 rehearsals in the space. To see that transition happen was really amazing. But I think you also brought up a good point about post. We have to wear the reputation of pulling this off. Like, you can't go backwards, because that's a big part of the accountability. If it does not continue to be the same or more of, or continue to deepen in terms of how it's handled, then it looks transactional. And then when you look at the context of the moment, after the uprisings in the midst of the pandemic, then we're going to start to be a part of the narrative that's already building about whether organizations decided to react to the moment and aren't really, dedicated to really providing these kinds of opportunities in a real, authentic, and sincere way. And so that means that whatever happens next has to build on this. And it has to be thought of with the artists involved, because it also puts them in an awkward place to have been a part of it this year, for it to look really weird later. And then everyone's like, oh, hold on, isn't that the same thing you did? Weren't you do something with CPA? And then they're like, it puts them in this really, awkward space. The other thing is whether or not, another testament to this is going to be, if within the next 3 to 5 years, is there a possibility for these artists who kind of got this spark now to end up having developed or built a piece that ends up being being a part of a season? This relationship has been sparked and we're a part of the story of their careers. So how invested are we in continuing that relationship like we do the other artists that we work with? Because all of these artists, having had this experience, could easily, within the next 3 to 5 years, have a piece that, they're looking to build or developing or working on, that CPA could commission to be a part of a season like any other artist. And, so that accountability piece has a lot of layers to it. And I hope that all of that comes to fruition and it's something that we have to carry. But I hope also that other organizations and institutions are looking, because there's a lot of opportunity in this moment, but there's a lot of weight about this moment, because the moment will become a part of the narrative if you're not consistent about how you responded in the moment and carrying that forward. And I've seen a lot of people respond. There's been a lot of meetings. Artists are being called into a lot of, focus groups, and all of our thoughts are being asked. And so I don't know if everybody's aware that if you bring us to the table, when it's all said and done, you're now on the clock and we're watching you from that moment forward. Yeah, any other thoughts or comments? I mean, y'all are all welcome, jump in and you know, there's so much.
I have so many comments and thoughts and a question actually, but just to say that, you know, in working with the writers on this project in particular, I just noticed that, you know, they also, each of them, you know, really spoke to me and said that they had an amazing experience as well on this. So I think it really speaks to the way that we've, I think, curated these relationships in a really thoughtful way and supported everyone involved. And, you know, that the fact that the writers also felt supported, I think, is just testament to how we've created this community. And to kind of Brian's point about, you know, thinking about cultivating, you know, local arts criticism, et cetera, I think in this iteration of the festival, it's also the writing became kind of even more somehow it was kind of part of a translation that happened, right? Because we're not going to the theater to see these works live. Yeah. The writing became like itself like a kind of collaboration with the work and became an extension of it, because it was through the words, you know, that people are also absorbing this, because that was another piece of media, you know, that we're dealing with in addition to the video, you know, because we've thought a little bit about also how this festival is also really about film production, you know, and the work that the videographers did had a huge impact on how, you know, we experienced the work as audience. So I think that in comparison to the, you know, the writing and the video were these kind of dual media that really added, you know, a kind of another layer, or like kind of helped in a way to kind of complete the work or translate it to an audience. And I would also say that it's interesting, please correct me if I'm wrong, someone, but I believe Ishad Howard applied last year to this festival, and the fact that he knew about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I didn't know that he applied. Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that firstly, he knew about it and it was on his radar, and then now he's able to be a part of it, you know, again, I think also speaks to the testament of Dasan, your, you know, involvement in this festival. And I'm curious to know, you know, just to think a little bit about, you know, what might be next for these artists and how CPA can support them. I mean, Chris, you talked about developing, you know, different kinds of work and presenting pieces kind of down the line. And you mentioned that for so many of these artists, it's in order to kind of gain some of the opportunities at home, they would have to go away and then come back. And the fact that they're now having these opportunities in that step, in this moment now, you know, what do you see as being next for some of these artists? And, you know, even beyond, you know, just kind of like us presenting them, do you see it being important that now the next step is to go away? And how also, you know, can we relate these artists to, like, we're supporting them through this festival, but we're also working so much in community with, you know, our artists in residence through Creative Futures. So how do you see those multiple kind of platforms for local work at CPA to be developed?
Well, I know that all of these artists are inspired, and they see, both in terms of having gone through the process, but also with the premieres and the talkbacks, and just, you know, really, because then they get to see the response of viewers to the work. And you're right, the videography has a big impact. I think what they've gained from this moment by having this work in a way that is different from having the work staged is there's an excitement about being able to eventually have the opportunity to stage the work and do it live. But to see it translate on film and still be impactful means that they're carrying two different ways to think about their work. in terms of what it means to be filmed, and then also what it means to do what many of them are familiar with, which is be on a stage. And so I know they're going to be thinking about other opportunities. And here's the thing about the arts ecosystem that this does, at least in my mind, as an artist and a curator, is that they now have work. They now can think of their work in ways that widens the curators in the area that they can work with. Because there's a lot of folks who have platforms for art and music that some of these artists wouldn't think about. Poets sometimes get called, but not in the way that the poets were able to present themselves as a part of the festival. And the door opens for collaboration. There's a lot of music happenings. One of the questions from the talk back with Ashad asked him about, you know, had he thought about doing his piece with a live band? And he lit up. So then that opens the door for him to think about, you know, we have a wonderful music ecosystem out here, so many talented musicians in the area. And so that opens the door for the kinds of artists he may think to work with. And that's the kind of impact this has. Like that's why I said 3 to 5 years, there's no telling what they're going to envision themselves doing or who is going to want to work with them based off of seeing them in this light and the other kinds of events that curators are doing that they're going to find themselves creating work for. And any of that can bubble to the point of them finding themselves, you know, bringing work back to CPA as well as to any other arts presenter. So I think that has an impact. But, you know, so, and even with Ashad, from the last time to this time, part of the difference, you know, I don't want to take credit for that. Part of the difference is that between last time and this time, he personally has been pushing the boundaries of his work. And that led him to a place of envisioning this particular idea, which resonated this time to the panel than it did last time. You know, there's a lot of reasons why, you know, but he was in position, you know, his continual growth helped push that. And, you know, just with each of these artists, I see that.
Yeah, I would also say that, you know, I remember in the panel selection meeting, you know, we were really, I mean, his application was very focused on work that he had done over the past year. So that was new for us. And just to say that, you know, that selection process was incredible because everyone really on the panel was sort of on board and in agreement with the artists that were selected. Like it was very clear to us that there were this group, and you know, I just think it speaks to the strength of the submissions.
I have a question for you. Well, one of the questions for you, Brian, about just writing, just the writing grind, because, you know, I think this is an, you know, how this fits into that, into the grind of looking for pieces to write, looking for placement for your writing, and that whole thing that writers have to do as they're kind of, you know, embarking on their careers, freelancers, and you know, and how something like, you know, including writing so intentionally in something like this, what does that do for that trek?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll say, you know, last year I wrote about the project itself, but I wasn't really able to write about the performances because I was the editor of the newspaper. I was already like treading this line of conflict of interest by doing this collaboration with an organization that we review critically and don't necessarily usually have that kind of collaborative relationship with. So this year, you know, as a freelancer writing a column, it was a pleasure to be able to actually engage with the artists themselves more. And I can tell that they all had really good experiences and were really energized by the process, just from how much all of them wanted to talk to me, which isn't the case when people are having if they're having a really bad experience, they want to talk to me. But if they're having like a mixed or mediocre experience, nobody is like burning to tell me that story. But all these artists were really keen to tell me like all about their experience, which was so gratifying to hear. And I felt bad that I couldn't put them all in. But, you know, I did tell them all, like, hey, I cover the arts here in a variety of ways, and like, we're in touch now. So next time you've got something going on, feel free to, you know, drop me a line. And that's just how this whole thing works. Networks, connections, relationships. So because of the Commons, they made a connection with a journalist like me, who they then feel they have a pipeline to. It's one more kind of like hook they can get into this world of the performing arts. Of course, I already knew all these artists. I know Anthony's work well from Shali Dance Works. I wrote a long feature about Ishad's Cypher University just last year. I ran a long feature about Ayana when she won the big poetry competition that Thomas I. McDonald wrote. So all these artists were familiar to me, but getting to engage with them in this entirely new context for them was really different and exciting. So where this all fits into the world of journalism and criticism, I mean, I don't want to overtake this whole thing with that, because that could be a whole like symposium on itself. I'm sure you all have read and heard and observed that journalism and arts journalism in particular is in crisis. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who works in that industry, like, no, it's really in crisis. Like, it's not just something people are saying. It's not just something like you read. Like, it's pretty bad. I mean, the INDY is one of, like, you can count the number of genuine, independently owned, quality alt weeklies left in the country on one hand. And I'm really proud that we are, you know, one of them that's still here. Although I fear how long that can possibly last in the economy we're in now, where people decreasingly want to read and increasingly want to watch short video content, and where money to fund particularly journalism and arts journalism of substance is getting really, really hard to find. This has been happening for years. I mean, vulture capitalists are swooping in and buying a lot of the legacy brands and vetting them and turning them into content mills that nobody wants to read, laying off all the good experienced writers and editors, and, you know, hiring underpaid people to grind out, you know, clickbait. Especially since COVID, a lot of places, national places, have closed down their freelance budgets. They just have their staff cranking out all their content, and there's fewer places for freelancers to get national work. And on the local level, if you want to write about art seriously, or if you're an artist who wants to get covered seriously, especially since the NNO basically abdicated the field of arts criticism publicly and overtly a couple years ago, said we're not doing this anymore. The INDY is almost kind of the only game in town that's consistent and that has kind of a broad platform. I mean, I guess that's great for our authority, but that's not at all how we want it to be. Because while the INDY has survived, while other papers have gone under, it's certainly experienced a lot of attrition in staff and in resources. It's increasingly fewer people doing increasingly more work, trying to run a full-fledged print product and a fully functioning website all together at the same time. They don't have the bandwidth to cover but a fraction of what's going on around here. And they don't have the bandwidth to cover that fraction always with the depth that it deserves. That's no fault of the INDY. That's the fact that the technology is changing the industry, and the industry is kind of falling apart. And it's not clear what people value as far as reading journalism goes and what they're willing to pay for it yet, and how that's going to shape up. So my interest in a project like this largely stems from that fact that it involves alternate sources for funding a kind of a art form and a cultural form that threatens to basically go extinct if it's left to commercial devices alone. There's not enough money and will in the industry for private institutions to do the kinds of like arts criticism and journalism at the volume we need. But I do feel there's a big opportunity for institutions like UNC, like Carolina Performing Arts, to step in and fill that gap. And they probably need to, if we're going to maintain any kind of culture of arts criticism. Frankly, I don't know, I don't even know if there are enough young people left who want to to learn it. And there's no economic incentive for them to want to learn it. But I think that could change if the universities can make it seem like something that there's more of a credible pathway to. I think that involves more teaching around it and more projects like this. I mean, yes, this is the kind of coverage that the INDY could have done, but this is coverage that we didn't have to pay for. That meant it was just like more we could do in addition to the things that we could pay for. And I think there are opportunities for institutions to fund really important work in journalism and criticism that isn't being funded anywhere else that serves the institutions and the area, as well as writers and readers. I'll give you an example. Right now, I'm working on a story for the INDY. That's why I'm sorry about my headband. I've been on this crazy deadline, no time for grooming, and my pandemic mane was untamable, so I just had to like whip it back, but I gussied it up with a nice sweater. So I'm on deadline with this really big story about the NC Artists for Black Liberation movement. This is a group that 6 months ago put out a petition to North Carolina arts institutions outlining steps toward deep structural change around white supremacy and racial equity, with a 6-month deadline saying that if you don't have a plan developed by this time, we're going to alert your high-level donors and your boards of your organizational complacency and your racist policies. So I'm doing a pretty in-depth story on this, putting probably about 3 times as much work and time into it as the INDY can pay for, but it still doesn't feel like enough even doing that. Because it is such a rich and huge topic with actually rich implications for kind of the structural aspects of booking an arts festival and running an organization that we've been talking about today. So, sorry, I interrupted myself and lost my train of thought. Right, but as I was approaching museums and arts institutions to interview them about this topic, I told them all, like, I'm not here to do like a racial equity scorecard for every organization in the Triangle. Partly to like put their minds at ease, to talk to me more openly. But I also told them, like, I think that would be a really worthy project, but it's not one the INDY or any other independent journalism organization who would care about such a thing is equipped to fund. Hiring a journalist to really crunch into the numbers and the data on every arts organization in the Triangle and seeing how they stack up according to different racial equity benchmarks. That would be a super worthy project that there's not enough money or media, not enough money or will left in the media to fund. But a university or an adjunct of a university like Carolina Performing Arts certainly could undertake an endeavor like that and be able to afford to pay a competent data journalist enough to do it right in a way that somewhere like the INDY certainly cannot, because frankly, they're just fighting for survival. So that's what excites me about the university bringing writers into this process. And I'm really interested in seeing other spaces where that kind of collaboration might grow, because I think it's essential to the future of arts criticism and arts journalism and the whole ecosystem. So that's my soapbox journalism.
No, thank you, Brian. Because, and I think I'm glad you said all of that, and then glad you put that out about what could be possibly funded. And also, one of the things I think that a lot of organizations, institutions are facing, especially MUPs, university presenters, is widening the reach and being able to actively involve the writers the way that the Commons has is a way of ensuring that you are having folks who are finding out about the festival that are beyond who might naturally be normal patrons in your patron pipeline. Mm-hmm. Because of the placement of the writing and who's writing and who reads that. And, just the reality of what the INDY means for finding out and keeping track of arts and culture in the area. is a little, once again, it goes back to, it just looks a little different to folks who've gotten used to a pattern of things. It disrupts that pattern in a way that draws some more eyes. And I think that there's a possibility for other projects to think about adding this piece to it as a way of getting past that. In addition to being able to provide more opportunities for writers. I'm glad you said that, because I don't think that gets thought about.
I'm really happy to get my writers a paycheck on this. I was like, yes, I want to get some of my favorite writers some university money, please.
Yeah. I mean, there's that, which is another way of contributing to the arts ecosystem. Because I for years, I don't really think, especially because we're such a transplant area and so many people move here, I don't think folks understand how hard it is, why we're still so reliant on word of mouth, and why there's still such a struggle to promote and get people out to things, because there isn't that coverage. There's been a gap for years, and there are things that pop up, and the INDY is the only thing that survived. There's been so many other periodicals and things that pop up and look good, and 6 months later they're gone.
They're gone, and they don't have a centralized audience or consistency that keeps people being like, okay, this is where I go to like find out what's going on. Yeah, you believe it or not, we used to have 2 alt weeklies. I started my career at the other alt weekly in the Triangle, which was called The Spectator in Raleigh. But by the mid 2000s, it had the INDY had bought it and put it out of business, and then we were down to 1 alt weekly. And frankly, I'm amazed and grateful that we still have that in the way this industry is going. I think I saw some questions popping up while we were having that. So if they were,
from Lauren, comments from Lauren and Alyssa.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that I think that that's an amazing idea, Brian, about like, I mean, just the idea of kind of thinking about like arts investigative journalism sort of as a way to hold institutions accountable. I think we don't necessarily think about arts and culture writers as doing that, and I think that's it's a great idea. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the way that the INDY is funded right now, and how that has decreased. And I mean, I think the idea about collaborating with educational institutions is also really interesting, but I'm curious to hear about just where you guys get your funding.
Yeah, Lauren, as to, I mean, it's interesting that you say you didn't think of that being something arts and culture writers do. I mean, I guess if they're just like critics or they write soft profiles, they don't. Personally, I do both. I write criticism and, like human interest profiles, but I also do a good bit of like enterprise and investigative work around the arts. It wasn't really what I did when I started at the INDY, but after 8 years, it's certainly what I ended up doing a lot of, because as I gained, power at the institution, it became incumbent on me to do those things, because we can't separate our aesthetic appreciation of what happens in the arts on stage from our knowledge of a lot of the kind of injustice and inequality that goes on backstage. So yes, writers do that, but that kind of journalism is really expensive because it's an enormous amount of work, as I can tell you from the story I'm working on right now. I've got 10,000 words in a document. I'm trying to get down into a 2,000 word story. And there is definitely a funding gap for that kind of work. So I think we need to look at alternate sources of revenue to fund that kind of enterprise investigative arts journalism, because it's just not really available. I'm sorry, everybody is frozen up. Am I frozen up too?
No.
Oh, maybe everybody was just being really still. Okay. So, but okay, so Lauren, so this gets to your question. So right, yes, there are people who do that kind of work. I do that work, but when I do it at the INDY, I have to do it at kind of like a big loss because they just can't afford to buy what enterprise like investigative journalism like that really costs. So we do need alternate funding sources for it, and maybe the university is a promising source. So the INDY is still funded by advertising sales, as well as by its INDY Press Club, which only launched within the last couple of years, which is like a NPR-like sustainer club. The intent, of course, is to always keep the paper free. I mean, I think if it's not free, it's not the INDY, because we have a responsibility to reach as many people as we can and reduce barriers to access as much as we can, which is why we still publish a print product, because not everybody is going to seek us out on the internet. Not everybody has that kind of access or is on the like social media networks where they will see that. But if we have a print product on the street, there's at least the chance that people of all different stripes could see what we're putting out there. So we continue to put out a print product despite that making no economic sense and being kind of a big part of the economic hardships that papers face, trying to continue a print product while also having a robust website, which is really where you're getting a lot of your eye share. The INDY Press Club has been, fairly successful. There are enough people here who recognize the value of having one of the last genuine alt weeklies in the country, and are willing to support us on a monthly basis or by one-time donations. Print ads are still the most lucrative thing, and the print ad market is still bottomed out. It was before COVID, and you can imagine how much worse it is since all the businesses that buy print ads have been basically closed. And nobody makes much money off of web advertising. We do that, but nobody's really cracked the code on how to make substantial money from that yet. The other aspect is newsletters. Selling advertising on our newsletters like the INDY Daily and the New Arts newsletter that just launched, as well as others, sponsored e-blasts. That I believe is more lucrative and has a more possible sustainable future than trying to sustain revenue off print ads or even web ads. We're seeing a lot of journalism move to this kind of newsletter and e-blast format. I spend the first hour of my day now reading all my Substacks from all the arts journalists who've been laid off or quit in a huff at their other publications and are now doing the newsletter model thing. So there's a lot of we have the responsibility to put out news and information on so many different fronts through so many different channels. It's really hard to bind them together in like a lucrative monetary strategy. And such a paper as ours really only exists for now insofar as like one relatively wealthy person is willing to lose money on them. And that's kind of where things are. Sorry to not have better news for you.
No, thank you for that. It just, I think, illustrates kind of the dire nature of, free and open exchange and intellectual dialogue, or dialogue that's like substantive, that's in print at the moment in our changing media landscape.
It is, yeah. And it also cuts off, the lack of if there aren't robust ongoing local outlets for journalism, you can get a voice still, which is important. You can have a variety of voices, but where you start to cut yourself off at the knees is like experience and expertise. When I report on this area, I'm reporting on this area based on 20 years of reporting on this area and like the knowledge and the history and the connections I built up in that time. I think that has unique and substantive value that you don't get from just like random people writing about random national topics. There's a level of understanding you don't get unless you have local people writing for local people about local things. And I think the severe lack of places and the under-resourcedness of places to sustain that is really damaging, obviously to the journalistic ecosystem, but also to the artistic ecosystem and even just the social ecosystem. It's really important that people are funded to do unsexy local journalism because that really matters, and it kind of provides like the granular substance under kind of the big overarching like national things. And it's really like dying out across the country, places for people to actually be given the resources to do that kind of reporting and to do it with that kind of like long-term commitment and focus that's cumulative. So now I'm looking around and asking like, so where are those resources coming from next? And are there opportunities, at institutions like yours to make collaborations like that happen and to fund this work that's not going to get funded elsewhere?
Wow. So yeah, and I think we're fortunately at the point in time where we're going to start where we're going to have to close. But I think all of this is important. you know, Brian, you mentioned earlier the relationship these artists now have with you, which is such an important part of the local art scene, you know. And there have been writers, you know, at the INDY with the Herald Sun, more so than the NNO if you're in Durham. There was one writer that you knew you could reach out to as an arts organization or as an artist about events, and to make sure that coverage was happening.
Yeah.
These relationships are important, and for the Commons to be able to intentionally make those connections is important. And so there's so many intersecting things when you decide to focus resources on your area community. There's so many dominoes that fall. There's so many intersecting opportunities, there's intersecting challenges, but it does have a major impact. And it's important for institutions and organizations to do it in a real intentional way. Part of that is also keeping, you know, and I want to close by saying that, like, part of it is keeping an eye to your local arts community, because you can have a sense of what you think the community, what's happening and what it needs. But that's different from having an awareness. Having a sense and having an awareness, two different things. Having an awareness it means that you're being intentional and inclusive, so that you can stay aware of what's happening and what the changes are and where is that coming from. Having a sense is just, you know, it's oftentimes how you create that divide with your arts community, because they're like, nobody in your area arts community wants to feel like you're up on the hill and you know everything, but you've never bothered to come down the hill and ask. And I think that what the Digital Commons has done is it's kind of like, it's come down the hill, and it feels like that it was really a part of the community over the course of the festival. So I just want to say that. Brian, thank you. Thank you to everyone who was a part of this conversation. And CPA will announce when these shop talks are up and available. We had one around production, one around artists and audience service, one in front of house audience services, and one around artist services, as well as this conversation. So all of the conversations have been wonderful. So, you know, for anyone who involved in the arts, let them know when you see that these are available to check them out and spread them around. And all of them have been from the voices of those who are immersed in the work. So
Terrific.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dasan. And y'all give me a call whenever you're ready to fund that data journalism project I was talking about, okay?
We're gonna stay in touch about that.
All right, well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, y'all.